time for a reset. This is what British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is hoping for Britain's relations with the rest of Europe after Labour's recent big electoral victory. Can it be done? Warm words are spoken in Brussels, Paris and Berlin, but what do they amount to? As both sides navigate shared issues, from trade and climate change to Russia's war in Ukraine and the rise of China, what can Britain and the EU do to repair their relationship and tackle these challenges together? Hello and welcome to a new season of Europe Inside Out, Carnegie Europe's monthly podcast about the continent's greatest foreign policy challenges. My name is Peter Kellner and I'm a non-resident scholar at Carnegie Europe. This episode of Europe Inside Out is about EU-UK relations and what we should expect from newly elected executives in London and Brussels. I'm joined by Kim Darroch, member of the House of Lords and former British ambassador to the United States, and indeed UK permanent representative before that to the European Union. Kim, welcome.
It's a great pleasure.
Kim, let's start with the big picture before we get into the details. Keir Starmer talks about a fundamental reset in relations with the EU. Looking at the broad issues of Britain's economy and place in the world, do we need a reset, and if so, why?
I think you have to start, Peter, with the impact of Brexit. I mean, now I think it's, 8 years since the decision, since the vote to leave the EU. And the evidence of its economic damage is piling up. And you can take any one of a number of statistics, just to quote a couple of them off the top of my head. There's Bloomberg's estimate of £100 billion cost to the economy. There is Goldman Sachs' estimate of 5% wiped off economic growth. And perhaps most significant, there is the government's budget authority, the Office of Budget Responsibility, saying that Brexit has led to a 4% reduction in long-term UK productivity relative to staying in the EU. Look, it feels like that too. I mean, the British economy has been stagnant, very low growth levels. Part of it, of course, was the pandemic. But even setting that aside, we are not doing well economically. We still do about 40% of our trade with the European Union, and we have basically imposed a lot of obstacles to that with Brexit. So the idea that we need to do something to change that seems to me self-evident and inarguable.
Inside Britain, there are two sides to the argument. One side says the pro-Brexit lobby. This is because Brexit hasn't been done very well by the previous Conservative government. Had it been done properly, we wouldn't have these problems. On the other side, there's the argument that it was inevitable. Brexit, by its nature, was going to cause these huge economic problems. Where do you come down on that argument?
I think the second one is the honest argument. It's not one you heard much actually during the Brexit campaign, but the first argument is just, for me, pure fantasy. After all, we had a government for most of the period of Brexit implementation that was going for the hardest Brexit option out here. Certainly that was where the Boris Johnson government was. I mean, Theresa May wanted perhaps a softer form, but it was still at the hard edge of the spectrum. The economic damage is clear for all to see. We've had the reality of the difficulty of doing alternative trade deals around the world. And we've seen the impact that Brexit has had, I think, on the economy across the board. So I think it was Dominic Cummings who said, of course, there will be economic damage. That is certainly what has happened. You can argue that over time, maybe that damage will disappear because we will do new trading relationships. Or you can argue, as I tend to, that this damage is permanent unless we do something to take away the barriers that we've created in our relationship with the EU.
Yes, Dominic Cummings, he was the most important organiser of the original referendum campaign to get Britain out of the EU. Let's narrow on what's happened in the last couple of years. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister until the election this year, he essentially inherited the Brexit deal that had gone through Parliament 2 or 3 years earlier. He has done various things like the Northern Ireland Protocol to sort out the messy business of Britain, the trade between mainland Britain and Northern Ireland, which is still part of the UK, rejoining the Horizon Science programme, taking part in a new European political body, which President Macron has been at the forefront of. Did Rishi Sunak do all he reasonably could, or did he make things worse?
I suspect that in a perfect world, Sunak would have liked to go a bit further than he did. But two constraints applied. First of all, lack of time. And second, I don't think he could have brought the Conservative Party as it was in that last Parliament with him on anything more radical than the steps that he took. The steps were all the right things to do, although the government made them more difficult and more complicated than they needed to be. And of course, the sort of jewel in that crown, although it's not a very big jewel, was in sorting out the Northern Ireland Protocol. By the way, just as an aside, Peter, the Northern Ireland Protocol essentially gives Northern Ireland the best of both worlds. In other words, it's sort of part of the single market, but it's also part of the UK. And this is advertised to Northern Irish people as a fantastically good deal, a better deal than the rest of the UK has, because they have both. And you kind of think, if you live in the rest of the UK, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could all have that, please? And why is the government thinking that it's fine for Northern Ireland but not fine for the rest of us? But anyway, that's the world that we live in. But Sunak did as much as he reasonably could on the whole, I think. And he also improved a bit the atmospherics of relationship with the EU. But then that couldn't have done anything else. I mean, they're so bad were they under the Johnson government.
Kim, given your long diplomatic experience, how much do atmospherics count for?
Yeah, that's a good question. And one shouldn't overestimate. In the end, it is substance that really counts. And you like your ministers as an official have good relations with their counterparts. They understand the substance of what they are negotiating on and strike the best possible bargain. But look, if atmospherics are very bad, and in particular, as was the case under the Johnson government, there is no trust, because the government was saying to itself it might simply tear up the agreement it had signed if it couldn't somehow change it and improve it. Then you're in a very bad place, and it's going to be very difficult to make progress of any kind because the other side doesn't trust what you say.
Let's move on to where we are now. 2 months ago, Britain chose to elect a new government, Keir Starmer heading a Labour government, and the atmospherics seem to be pretty good. In the last few days, he's had constructive conversations with Chancellor Scholz and President Macron. I think he's heading off to Brussels in the near future. He talks about a fundamental reset. What do you understand he's after?
I think that, first of all, you have the happy coincidence that you have now centre-left governments in London, Paris and Berlin. And that certainly helps with the atmospherics. And I think Keir Starmer has done well in his first few weeks in making the most of that reality and in striking up what looked to be good personal relations with his French and German counterparts. But I hesitate and start to think there's a bit of hype here when I hear about a fundamental reset on the back of the Starmer-Scholz meeting early this week. And here's why. As I've said, the crucial thing about economic relations with the EU, I think will have most benefit for us with our economic performance so weak at the moment, will be getting much closer to the single market. That isn't in Scholz's gift. You need a deal with the EU on that. You can't do anything bilaterally about removing barriers to our access to the single market. Scholz is certainly an important voice around the European Council table, but he can't do anything by himself because the EU is a trading bloc. only negotiate with it as a bloc. You can do lots of cooperation on science, technology, and all sorts of interesting things. You can have more political dialogue, all the rest of it. But you can't change the nature of the UK relationship with the single market in any of its important elements just by a bilateral deal between UK and Germany. That's just the reality.
Right. So in the recent general election campaign, Keir Starmer said repeatedly, and I think he's repeated it the last few days in his meetings with Scholz and Macron, that Britain, under him, will not seek to go back into the single market, will not seek to go back into the customs union, and will reject any thought of freedom of movement, even for ideas of short-term working visas for younger people under 30. Can he stick to that? What can he do?
First of all, he had an election to win. He wanted to win back those so-called red wall seats, previously Labour safe seats, which the Tories had won in 2019. And he felt he had to be absolutely emphatic on no rejoining the EU, no wiggle room at all to get that. I don't know whether he really needed to say that, but he felt he did, and that's where we are. What I noticed, nevertheless, is British public opinion seems to me to be a bit ahead of where the Labour Party, Conservative Party are. The excellent YouGov did a lot of polling on this. I just noticed some recent polls, which I will quote. British opinion, public opinion, do we want to rejoin the EU? 53% support, 36% oppose. Should we rejoin the single market? 48% support, 25% oppose. Should we rejoin the customs union? 49% support, 20% oppose. Now, as a pollster, you'll tell me there's a lot within those figures that you need to unpack before you assume you can make policy on that basis. But I do think that public opinion has shifted quite a lot on Brexit. And I think that the Labour Party and this government are probably being overcautious on what is possible and that they could go further. He made those promises in the election campaign, but I think he could go further, particularly on single market membership, because there's a great myth out there that somehow all these single market rules are imposed on us. Truth is, when we were in the EU, we were a prominent part. I used to do this every day when I was a permanent representative, of making those rules. Nowadays, we have no part in making those rules, so we're rule takers rather than rule makers, but we're still doing 40% of our trade with the EU. So one way or another, you're following the rules. So why not, if you're going to do that, unless you really believe you can stop all this trade with the EU and just trade with New Zealand and Australia and Fiji instead under this Pacific deal, why not get a bit closer to it and just accept reality? If you're going to trade with other countries, you need to trade on the rules they have set, and the single market is where we should be making those moves.
I'd like to come back shortly to the longer-term possibilities of more radical measures like the single market and customs union. Meanwhile, what is on Keir Starmer's wish list? When he talks about a fundamental reset, what is he talking about rather than what is he not talking about?
What he's talking about, I think, is 3 or 4 things. Number one is a foreign policy, defence and security agreement, which I think he's given David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, the task of negotiating, which is basically putting a structure around, my friends in the Foreign Office who are still in the saddle, as it were, tell me ever since the Ukraine war started, there has been a huge amount of informal consultation, coordination with Europe, as you would expect, over sanctions policy, over how to handle Putin, of how to respond to the war, about how to support Ukraine. Now, it wouldn't just be about Ukraine. There's lots of other things going on in the world, Middle East, relations with China, all the rest of it. But this is putting a proper structure and formal channels and formal sequence of meetings around cooperation on foreign policy, on national security issues, and a bit more on defence. Quite how far it goes, we will see, because then you get into quite tricky questions about defence procurement rules and all that kind of thing. But at the least, much closer, more structured cooperation on the great foreign policy challenges of the age, I think, is number one objective. Then you get into a veterinary agreement, phytosanitary agreement, whatever you call it, but it's essentially about easing trade and removing barriers and delays in trade in animal and plant products across the EU, perishables, so things don't get stuck at the border, costing a fortune in refrigeration or just rotting away. Then you get into something potentially about visas for artists so that our orchestras and our pop groups and our travelling theatres can go to Europe more easily and at much, much less cost, and vice versa. And then there is something still out there potentially about youth mobility. So young people and students from both the EU can come to the UK and the UK can go to the EU much more easily, the way they used to, but much more easily than they can now post-Brexit.
Okay, on that particular point, there have been a lot of stories in the last few weeks that from the Brussels end, there's a lot of enthusiasm for limited freedom of movement for young people. Britons going across the Channel, people from Europe coming to Britain. But Keir Starmer seems to consistently reject this. What's going on?
Well, there's some tricky stuff in here. It is reported that the EU said, hang on, this deal would involve allowing young people from 27 countries to come to one country, but allowing that one country to send its students, its young people, to 27 countries. That's a bit unbalanced. That's a bit asymmetric. So we need a bit more concessions from the UK to balance this out. And the immediate response from the British government was negative. And I think that the EU had handled it rather clumsily in the way that they made this potential demand public. And there's been a bit of a reset going on. But I think this is still on the agenda. I think it will actually restart and they'll get somewhere.
Now, returning briefly to the veterinary rotting foods and all that, if Britain asks for this, what will Brussels want in return? In other words, can Keir Starmer get his wish list, or will he run into difficulties when he tries to negotiate them?
There is a concern in the Commission about what they call cherry picking, which in other words is we try to get a much better deal on single market access by picking out the best bits while not taking on any of the commitments and obligations of single market membership, which they would say included free movement and paying into the EU budget. Now, they obviously, surprisingly, prefer this government to its predecessor because the tone is so much more positive. But they still worry about cherry picking and about us Brits managing to get the best bits of EU membership in terms of access to the single market without the obligations and the costs. So you've seen two things. One is Brussels, I think on the 15th of July, they presented to the Europe Minister a list of 8 tests, demands of the UK, which are basically about full and proper implementation of all the existing post-Brexit arrangements. They say that one of these is we haven't properly implemented the Northern Ireland Protocol. Another is we're not properly recognising what we promised to do in terms of rights and status of EU citizens in the UK. There's also issues about authentic and accurate certification of animal products and plant products, and about a pet checking scheme and this kind of thing. So there's some quite sort of small detail in it, but there's a list of 8 demands where they say we're not actually doing what we promised to do yet. Second, I don't think they've actually said this yet publicly, Peter, but when we did the post-Brexit deal on fisheries, part of it was that over 5 years, up to 2026, 25% of the EU fishing quotas in British waters would be transferred back to the UK to benefit British fishermen. Now, this is massively unpopular, of course, particularly in France, but not just in France. And this deal comes up for renegotiation in 2026. That's when it expires and needs to be reviewed and new quotas set. So there is already speculation that as a price for doing a deal on things we want, like the veterinary agreement, the EU will say, we'd like rather bigger fishing quotas next time round. And that's the kind of transactional sort of process and demands that, frankly, I would be surprised if the Commission didn't do.
It sounds to me, from what you're saying, Kim, that there's an imbalance. You say it's transactional. Keir Starmer is keen to get these things. It doesn't seem to me that anybody in the EU is that bothered whether they do a deal or not. Couldn't this just run on and on and on and just run into the sand and get nowhere?
I think that certainly because we are still a major military power and we have a lot of foreign policy knowledge and experience and clout still around the world, I think that the foreign policy and national security deal is of clear benefit to them as well as us and no particular cost. So I think that can happen. I think the veterinary agreement, and there's a lot of EU exports to the UK of foodstuffs, this kind of thing. So that's also mutual benefit to the EU. They always exported more goods to us than we did to them. We made up that gap in services. The deal just covers goods, and it's a very nice deal for them. They won't see any massive advantage for them in renegotiating it so it's a better deal for us, unless there is something more in it for them. Second point, they have three big headline issues they have to think about. There is internal dynamic and the rise of the far right in Europe. There is what they would call the deteriorating international context, war on the European continent, potential instability in the Middle East, the challenge from China. And there is a difficult economic outlook for them all because none of them are doing economically that much better, and some of them are doing worse than the UK is. Those are, they would say, the three big challenges facing them, and doing new deals with the UK comes somewhere down the top 10 list on that.
Right. Well, it sounds to me as if we'll get towards the end of this 5-year parliament and Britain may have achieved a few things, probably not everything it wants. Let's just, for the sake of argument, suppose that at the next British election due in 2029, Keir Starmer realises he has to go much further on issues such as the single market, customs union, freedom of movement, and puts that into Labour's manifesto. He seeks a mandate from the British people to go much further. So he goes to Brussels shortly after the next election and says, right, we're ready for a big deal. Could he get one? Oh, because, as you say, the EU has moved on, would they regard Britain as just too much trouble?
There's a lot of known unknowns in that question, Peter, but let me try and speculate and answer it. I mean, first, the qualification or the context point. If they're going to get re-elected, they need to get economic growth restarted and they need to sort out our public services, which are plummeting and in a really parlous state. And I won't need to list all the problems we faced, from bankrupt local governments to a failing National Health Service to hopeless deteriorating infrastructure and so on. Now, to get the money to tackle these problems, you need economic growth of more than 1% a year. If he can get to 2% plus and it looks steady and it looks consistent and there's money coming into the exchequer, without doing something radical on Europe, maybe he just carries on with the status quo. I think that's quite a stretch to see that happening, given the economic damage that Brexit has done. So maybe in 2029, maybe earlier, he decides to go for another election and he puts in his platform something about the EU. I mean, there's various choices there. There's rejoining the customs union, there is rejoining the single market, and there is trying to rejoin the whole thing. And I don't think he would ever go for rejoining the whole thing. I noticed, by the way, he said just before the election, he didn't expect the UK to rejoin the customs union, the single market, or the EU in his lifetime. I don't mind him talking about parliamentary terms, but saying in his lifetime, that seems to me quite a stretch. But anyway, just supposing he wants to change his mind. I think two things. One, he would say, we are going to explore the possibility for rejoining the single market or the customs union or whatever. I don't think he would go any further than that. You will have a referendum on whether to do it or not. So he would say that the choice is still for you, but let's have a go and see what we could get. That's one side. Would the EU want it? The EU is divided into two groups of countries. A larger group, between 2/3 and 3/4 membership, who are net recipients from the EU budget. Some of them large sums of money, most of them Central European countries, not just Central European countries. And then you have a group of countries that are net payers. We were quite big net payers, even with Mrs. Thatcher's rebate. If you were to rejoin the single market, you would have to, one, go back into paying into the EU budget. I think, given the economic damage of being outside the single market, would be money well spent, but it would be a controversial political issue, and we wouldn't get a rebate this time round. Second, you would have to accept free movement. And those are two really quite big things for the British public to accept. Now, both paying into the EU budget and accepting free movement would be very controversial issues in the UK. I can make the arguments for them. Whether the British public would accept them or not, I don't know. But that would be why you would have to offer a referendum before you even took the step of rejoining the single market.
OK, let me finally move on to a bit of crystal ball gazing. We've talked about the issues short and medium term. What would be your best guess at this moment of where Britain's relationship with the EU will be in 10 years' time?
This comes down, Peter, to a tussle between my personal preferences and the political realities as I see them. But I think things will err towards caution rather than towards radicalism or ambition. I think we might actually think about rejoining the customs union or the single market, and we might negotiate something that's different from our rejoining, because we'd essentially be, we'd be members of the European Economic Area. And I think that's just about possible in 10 years, but I think it's a kind of 50-50 thing.
But let's suppose that Keir Starmer does want to do something like single market re-entry, something like customs union, something like freedom of movement in his second term. Would he get a deal with the EU to achieve those things?
If you were to rejoin the single market and the customs union, you would have to return to paying substantial sums into the EU budget, which then get redistributed to the poorer members of the EU. And you would have to accept free movement happening again, which the EU would quite like to see the UK included in. I don't see a problem really with the EU. Why wouldn't they want to expand the single market to include an economy, the sixth biggest economy in the world? It makes no sense that they wouldn't want to do that. I think membership is a different thing, because the reality is the Brits still have a fundamentally different vision and ambition for the future of the European Union than most of the continent do. We were blockers and holders back on a number of issues around EU construction, and they would suspect that we hadn't changed on that.
And do you think a second Labour government could achieve this, and would the EU accept it, if the Conservative Party is still in its recent anti-European mode and says, if Labour negotiates these and we return to power at the following election, we'll go back to Brexit?
I think if, in my imagination of how things will unfold, in running for a second term and putting this as an intention for the second term to negotiate, say, re-entry into the single market, Keir Starmer would certainly, surely, offer a referendum for the British people ultimately to choose. If you're going to do that, you say to the Tory party, if you don't like it, you campaign against it. Let's see what kind of deal we get, and then gloves off, say what you want about it. But to even say you should never even negotiate it is sort of ridiculous.
Kim, it was a great pleasure having you on this month's episode of Europe Inside Out. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Peter, it was a great pleasure for me to talk about my favourite subject, so thank you for the opportunity.
For those who are interested in learning more about EU-UK relations, I encourage you to follow the work of Carnegie Europe on X, formerly Twitter, at Carnegie_Europe, and on LinkedIn. Our producers are Francesca Sicardi and Mattia Barrini. Our editor is Futura d'April of Europod. Sound engineering and original music by Jeremy Bouquet.